Hello, ladies and gents. Welcome to, gosh, is it week 8 already? That's crazy. Woo, 2 months in. Good job, guys. Just a couple more to go. We are, what, two-thirds of the way through the class? We're entering the home stretch. Bravo. At this time of the quarter, not you guys, because you're all amazing and totally highly motivated and all of that. But just in case that's not 100% true right now, it is very typical for students and for instructors, even sometimes, to kind of get the almost done doldrums in the quarter, which means you just kind of lose a little bit of steam and it feels like the quarter is stretching on forever. And you're like, oh, am I gonna make it to the end? It's gray and cold outside, and I just want to hide under a blanket and binge watch something, because that's kind of tis the season, right? So I just want to encourage you guys, if you are feeling that way, you are absolutely not alone. Because in my, what, many, many years of teaching since 2009, so a long time, um, this is the part of the quarter where everyone just starts to feel like, oh, I'm not going to make it. You are going to make it. From all those years of teaching, I know you're going to make it. It's just this weird little hump we've got over between like week 8 and week 9. It's this weird little thing that we kind of all experience. So I want to encourage you, hang in there. You're so close. You are so, so very close. We just have one major project left in the class. I'm almost done grading project 2, so you'll have that back to use all that information and feedback to continue to hone our writing skills and make our project 3 even stronger. So hang in there. I know it's really hard, but find the mechanisms that work well for you. If it's getting out and getting some fresh air, that's what works for me, even if it's cold outside. It sets a little reset button in my brain. For some folks, it's exercise, getting out, getting that heart rate up, getting a little more oxygen in your blood. For some folks, it's making something delicious to eat, uh, baking or cooking a yummy meal. Maybe it's a hot cup of tea or cocoa or coffee. Uh, Maybe it's chatting with a friend to like reinvigorate and find some energy. Find the thing that works for you. Turn on some pump up music, snuggle a pet, whatever gets those happy endorphins going in your brain. Everyone is different, but find the thing that pumps you up to help you get through this doldrum here because it's not easy. College is not easy. And I'm so proud of all of your persistence and grit and determination to find success here. You are doing phenomenal things. So hang in there through these doldrums. You've got it. Okay, there's my pep talk. Woo! Okay, so let's talk about this week so that you can keep that momentum going. This week, we are building the groundwork for our Project 3 essay. We talked about how all our projects are thematically linked. We've got this idea of justice and true crime and real life events, and how do we make sense of them as humans, and what does it say about the human condition and morality and all of that. Big ideas. So in Project 3, we're working with those big ideas too, and we're looking at how bias can cause conflict between groups, like this group and this group, conflict, right? So you've got a case list you're working with this week. You're going to pick one of those cases and you're going to start researching it and figuring out what two groups are involved, cultures, identities, however you want to describe it, and how did bias lead to this clash. So we've got lots to choose from in our case list, which are in the modules tab, and I'll show you in a minute. Um, but then you're gonna define those groups. You're gonna talk about how bias caused a clash or a tragedy, and then you're gonna talk about ways in which we can try to mitigate bias potentially, based on some of our readings last week, like our reading for the discussion board where we talked about all those studies about bias and how our brain is malleable even when we have um, biases we're not even totally aware of. We can become aware of them, and then we can start to make choices that maybe would mitigate any harm biases could cause. So if we take a look in our class modules folder, this week you're getting to do lots of cool research. And I've got lots of resources to help you with that. If you ever get stuck researching or you're not sure how to pull a paper together, remember you can always go to the CBC Writing Center. I would highly recommend making an appointment with them so you can have them for the full time frame with no interruptions. Here's the recorded lecture on how to schedule those appointments and how to make that thing work for you and how to get extra credit. All good stuff. So check that out if you haven't already. And then we are in project 3, so we can minimize all those. Look at all you've accomplished, guys. Bravo, little pat on the back there. Nice work. We are moving into our big resources for this essay. So we've got our cases of cultural bias list. Um, and this list, of course, is not exhaustive. There's a lot more cultural bias. If you've been watching the news at all about Palestine and Israel right now, the Hamas terrorists, and all the stuff that's going on there, you can bet your bottom dollar there are instances of cultural clash, right? Of biases that have just gone wrong in so many ways. Um, so that's not on our list because it's like a current event and it's currently happening and there's no resolution, so we couldn't write about how the problem ended because the problem hasn't ended. But you can pick something from the list. So last week we talked about the synagogue massacre. That was the case of the Jewish community being targeted by an anti-Semitic person who went in and killed a bunch of people in their religious service. The Pulse nightclub shooting happened when a club that was LGBTQ plus focused, a man named Omar Mateen came in and killed 49 people and wounded far more. He claimed affiliation with ISIS, so that's the identity that you would discuss for him. Now, when we're looking at identities, it's really important to use accurate, specific terms. For example, Omar Mateen claimed identity with ISIS. ISIS is a extremist religious terrorist organization. So that's important to say. He wasn't just Muslim, because Muslim is a religious group that has peaceful tenets that govern its members. This is a radicalized, violent terrorist organization. So they're different things, right? So we need to make sure that we're using accurate, specific language when we talk about those different things. In our recorded lecture, we used the example of the case of Sheriff Joe Arpaio. He was a very biased individual who had control of a lot of people's lives in Arizona. And this, like I said in the lecture, is kind of personal to me because I lived in Arizona for a long time and saw how this affected people every day. It affected my friends, it affected my students, it affected my coworkers because he detained people illegally. He put people in prisons that were inhumane. He caused the death of a lot of people. So you can look at him and look at how his identity of stereotypically older Caucasian man in power abused that power over minority groups who didn't have a voice. And so in this case, you would want to pick one victim group because he had a lot of victim groups. So you could talk about the prison populations as his victim group, or you could talk about the Latinx populations in Arizona as his group there. So you can choose because he victimized a lot of people. You can look at the Eric Gardner case. This case was a gentleman who was selling loose cigarettes out of his pocket, but that's illegal because of tax reasons. And he resisted arrest and ended up being killed while in officer custody as he was being taken to jail. So you can look at how these two groups tended to clash specifically in New York because they have a long history of clashing between specific groups, particularly lower socioeconomic status groups. So people in poorer neighborhoods, the unemployed, the homeless, and the police departments, because they had several policies that individual officers, of course, didn't have any control over, that made it very difficult to get along with those other populations. So for a while, they had a stop and frisk policy, so they could just stop anyone and frisk them with no evidence, no reason, just like because they wanted to. And you can imagine most people did not abuse this policy, but some people did, right? And so it caused a lot of tension between lower socioeconomic status groups and the police because they felt like the police weren't there to protect them, the police weren't there to help them, the police were there to catch them, So it's really hard to have good relationships there. So you can look at those two groups and how they ended up clashing in this tragic way because of this history of policies that made it so the two groups couldn't communicate, couldn't trust each other, and couldn't get along. You can look at the Brock Turner case if you don't want to see people, you don't want to talk about people dying. Nobody died in this one. It is a rape case though, so trigger warning. Um, Brock Turner was a college athlete who raped an unconscious woman at a party and got off basically with zero punishment because he was rich, he was an athlete, and he had influential parents and connections. And so all of that came together to make him have zero consequences for the action of raping this unconscious girl. And so you could talk about how his identity let him get away with a crime, while her identity made her just a faceless victim. And you could talk about victim shaming culture, particularly in rape, when it's brought to court. There's a lot of people who argue, oh, she was kind of asking for it, which is the absolute terrible worst thing to say, because of course she wasn't, because of what she wore, or because she had too much to drink, or any of those things that somehow made rape okay, is what the argument was being made in the courtroom. And so you could talk about how her identity and that victim shaming caused a clash between this rich athlete who had more value to the school and more value to society. And so he got away with it, and she has to live with the repercussions the rest of her life. So you could talk about that and those two different cultures there. There's the Charlton church shooting, happened in South Carolina, where a white supremacist KKK member came in to a prayer group, sat down and prayed with this group, and did a Bible study with them for like an hour, and then at the end stood up and murdered all of them. And so you could talk about the African American community as one group of culture, and then you could talk about the KKK white supremacist ideology, and then how obviously the KKK bias led to this tragedy. And then in very recent kind of events, you could talk about the rise of hate crimes against Asian Americans during the 2020 COVID period. Lots of research on this, unfortunately, where it's documented between March 2020 and June 2021 that more than 9,000 anti-Asian hate incidents took place and were reported to an advocacy group. And those were just the ones that were reported. So you can imagine that there were a lot more. Many made the headlines because they were brutal murders of people who felt that COVID was the fault of Asian Americans, which is a very weird ideology to have because, of course, Asian Americans did not have anything to do with how COVID was created. And so you could talk about this absolute conspiracy group of how like it was all a conspiracy. These people they had a plan and they were going to give us all COVID. And then you could talk about the Asian Americans and how they had to deal with this bias and violence for a really long time during the COVID pandemic. So lots of things you can choose from here. I've got hyperlinks in here to take you to news articles that can kind of give you some more background information if you're interested. And then we've got a lot of resources. I promise the video is almost done. I just had a lot to say today. More resources in our modules folder. So there's a whole resource on how to find sources in the CBC library databases. We've got that in the library time with Molly Mooney, who's amazing. She is my absolute favorite. She's like the Miss Frizzle of library, so check her out. Then you can live chat with a librarian to get help. And then also watch the recorded lecture part 1 and 2, and that will walk you through how to use the CBC library databases as well. So lots of great things coming our way. Look through those databases. You're going to be accumulating all that data and turning it into an annotated bibliography. Here is the walkthrough on how to do that. Make sure you watch that because it's going to help you. Annotated bibliographies are just a recorded journal of your research, but they do have special formatting, so make sure you check that out. And as always, if you have any questions, reach out. I'm here to help.